I said you're not man enough. He packed his bags and blocked me on everything I need to tell someone what I did. And you're going to think I'm terrible, but there's something about the way Connor just gave up on us that nobody understands. Everyone who knows about this, my sister, his brother, the mutual friends who have picked sides, they all think I'm this toxic nightmare who destroyed a good man with 4 words. And maybe I am. But the truth is so much more complicated than that, and the part that makes me look worst? I haven't told anyone yet. Not the real reason I said it. Not what I was actually trying to accomplish. Not what happened in the weeks before that made me so desperate I'd weaponize his deepest insecurity just to get a reaction. If I don't tell this story, you'll never understand why I'm still checking his Instagram through a fake account 3 months later, or why I haven't been able to look at myself the same way since. But once you know what I know, you'll see why I felt backed into a corner with no other options. Or at least, that's what I keep telling myself at 3 in the morning when I can't sleep. This isn't just about a fight that got out of hand. It's about the fact that I've spent my entire adult life terrified of becoming invisible, of being the person someone settles for rather than chooses every single day. It's about watching my mom fade into the background of my dad's life until she was just this silent fixture who existed to make his dinner and nod at his stories. And it's about the pattern I've noticed in every relationship I've ever had. The moment I sense someone pulling away, I become this other version of myself that I barely recognize. I'm going to tell you everything, including what I found on Connor's phone 2 weeks before the fight. And the part that makes me look worst, I'm saving that for the end because you need to understand how good things were in the beginning first. You need to see why losing him felt like losing my entire future, why I was willing to blow everything up rather than watch it slowly fade away. We met at a wedding, which sounds romantic until you realize it was his ex-girlfriend's wedding. Not that she was marrying him, she'd moved on to someone else. But Connor was there looking absolutely miserable in a suit that was slightly too tight, drinking whiskey like it was water, and making dark jokes to anyone who'd listen. I was the bride's cousin, bored out of my mind and trying to avoid my aunt's questions about why I was still single at 28. This whole thing is a monument to poor decision-making, he said, sliding into the seat next to me during dinner. He gestured at the elaborate centerpieces, the string quartet, the ice sculpture melting slowly in the corner. 2 years from now, she'll realize she picked the wrong guy, and all these flowers will just be a memory of the biggest mistake of her life. I should have recognized the red flag in that statement. The bitterness, the assumption that love doesn't last, the casual cruelty of showing up to someone's wedding just to mentally tear it apart. But instead, I laughed. I found it refreshing, actually. Everyone else was performing this choreographed happiness, and here was someone willing to acknowledge that maybe it was all bullshit. We spent the rest of the reception in the hotel bar, trading stories about our worst relationships. He told me about Hannah, the bride, how they dated for 3 years before she decided he wasn't ambitious enough, and left him for a guy who worked in private equity. I told him about Marcus, who cheated on me with a 19-year-old he met at his gym, then had the audacity to say I'd let myself go during our relationship. "You're way too interesting for that asshole," Connor said, and the way he looked at me made me feel like the most captivating person in the room. Not just pretty interesting, like my thoughts mattered, like my presence was magnetic. That's the thing nobody tells you about the beginning of toxic relationships. They don't start toxic. They start with someone seeing you in a way that feels almost addictive, reflecting back a version of yourself that's smarter and funnier and more desirable than you've ever felt before. Connor made me feel chosen. Urgently, specifically chosen. We started dating immediately, that intense kind of dating where you skip all the normal steps and plunge straight into domesticity. Within a month, he had a drawer at my apartment. Within 2 months, he'd introduced me to his entire family at his mom's birthday dinner. Within 3 months, we were talking about moving in together officially, maybe getting a dog, possibly looking at houses in the suburbs even though we both claim to hate the suburbs. "I've never felt this sure about anyone," he told me one night as we lay in bed, his fingers tracing patterns on my shoulder. "With Hannah, I always felt like I was auditioning for the role of boyfriend, like one wrong move and she'd replace me. But with you, it's different. I can just be myself." I held onto those words like a life raft. I memorized them. I replayed them whenever my anxiety started whispering that this was too good to be true, that someone like Connor, handsome, funny, emotionally available, wouldn't really choose someone like me unless something was wrong with him. Just when I thought I'd finally found the relationship that would prove my mother's marriage wasn't the template for all romance, I started noticing small things. The way Connor's phone was always face down on the table. How he'd become vague about his day when I asked questions. The fact that he'd stopped initiating sex as frequently, and when we did have it, he seemed distracted, mechanical. "You're being paranoid," my best friend Rachel said when I mentioned it. "You've been burned before, so you're looking for problems where there aren't any." Enjoy the good thing. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Connor was slowly backing away from us, creating invisible distance that I couldn't quite name or prove. He was still affectionate in public, still said I love you before bed, still showed up for the surface-level requirements of being a boyfriend. But something fundamental had shifted, and I could feel it in my bones. I started testing him in small ways. I'd mentioned plans for the future, a trip we talked about taking, the dog we were supposed to adopt, and watch his reaction. He'd agree enthusiastically, but it felt performative. Like he was placating me rather than genuinely engaging with our shared future. We should book that trip to Portugal, I said one Sunday morning while we were making breakfast. Definitely, he said, not looking up from the eggs he was scrambling. Soon. How about September? I can request those dates off this week. Let me check my work schedule first. Things are really busy right now. Things were always busy right now. He was a project manager at a tech company, and yes, there were legitimate demands on his time, but it felt like work had become his excuse for emotional unavailability. Every time I tried to have a real conversation about us, about where we were heading, he'd deflect with complaints about his job or suggest we talk about it later when he wasn't so stressed. I thought I was imagining things until I saw the text message. It was an accident. He'd asked me to check something on his phone while he was driving, and the preview popped up on his screen. From someone named Jesse, can't stop thinking about last night. My stomach dropped. Who's Jesse? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Connor glanced at the phone, and for just a second I saw panic flash across his face. Then it was gone, replaced by casual confusion. A coworker. We had a team dinner last night. He's probably talking about some inside joke from the restaurant. It was a perfectly reasonable explanation. It didn't explain why my hands were shaking or why every instinct I had was screaming that he was lying. I did what you're not supposed to do. That night after Connor fell asleep, I took his phone into the bathroom and went through his messages. I know it's a violation of privacy. I know it speaks to my own issues with trust and control. But I also know what I found, and I'm still not sure if I regret looking. There was nothing explicitly incriminating. No sex, no love confessions, no evidence of physical cheating. But there were dozens of messages between Connor and Jesse. Late-night conversations about their feelings, inside jokes, constant communication that had the emotional intimacy of a relationship. They talked about their childhoods, their fears, their dreams. Jesse sent Connor songs that reminded me of you. Connor sent Jesse photos of things he found funny throughout the day. All the emotional energy that had disappeared from our relationship, I could see exactly where it had gone. He was having an emotional affair, even if they'd never touched. He was giving someone else the parts of himself he used to give me. I didn't confront him immediately. Instead, I did something worse. I started competing with a person Connor didn't even know I knew about. I tried to be more interesting, more funny, more sexually adventurous. I suggested spontaneous date nights and tried to recreate the intensity we'd had in the beginning. I was performing my own version of the perfect girlfriend, trying to win back attention that I'd never actually lost because Connor didn't know we were in a competition. The more I tried, the more he seemed to pull away. It was like he could sense my desperation, and it repelled him. We started fighting about stupid things, whose turn it was to do dishes, whether we should go to his friend's party or stay home, what to watch on TV. Surface arguments that were really about the fact that we were both unhappy and neither of us was willing to say it out loud. Why are you being so needy lately? He asked after I got upset that he'd canceled our dinner plans to stay late at work. We don't have to spend every second together. That's not healthy. Needy. The word landed like a slap. I wasn't being needy. I was noticing that my boyfriend was emotionally checked out of our relationship. But I didn't know how to explain that without admitting I'd gone through his phone, without revealing that I'd seen the proof of his divided attention. So instead, I pulled back. I stopped initiating plans, stopped asking about his day, stopped trying to engage him in meaningful conversation. I thought maybe if I created some distance, he'd realize what he was losing and come back to me. Classic game-playing bullshit that has never worked in the history of relationships, except it kind of did work at first. Connor noticed the change and seemed almost relieved by it. He became more attentive again, more physically affectionate. We had a really good week where it felt like we'd found our rhythm again. We went to a concert, had incredible sex afterward, spent an entire Sunday in bed watching movies and ordering takeout. See, Rachel said when I told her things were better. We're just going through a rough patch, every couple does. But I couldn't let it go. The messages with Jesse were still happening. I'd started checking Connor's phone regularly, justifying it to myself as protecting my own interests, making sure I wasn't being completely played. And while the frequency had decreased slightly, they were still talking. Still sharing themselves with each other in ways that felt more intimate than anything Connor was sharing with me. The breaking point came on a random Tuesday in April. Connor came home from work in a terrible mood, throwing his bag down and pouring himself a drink before even saying hello. I asked what was wrong and he waved me off. Just work stuff, I don't want to talk about it. An hour later I saw him smiling at his phone, typing rapidly. I knew without looking that he was talking to Jesse, sharing the bad day that he wouldn't share with me. Something inside me just snapped. Are you cheating on me? I asked point blank. He looked up, genuinely startled. What? No, why would you ask that? Because you tell Jesse everything and you tell me nothing. Because you're more emotionally invested in a coworker than you are in your girlfriend. Because you've completely checked out of this relationship and I'm tired of pretending I don't notice. I watched his face go through several emotions: surprise, guilt, defensiveness, anger. You went through my phone, he said, and I noticed he didn't deny any of my accusations. Yeah, I did, and I found exactly what I thought I'd find. You're having a whole separate relationship that I'm not part of. We fought for hours. He insisted nothing physical had happened with Jesse, that they were just friends, that I was being controlling and invasive. I argued that emotional cheating was still cheating, that he'd been lying by omission, that our relationship had become a shell while he invested his real self elsewhere. Maybe I talked to Jesse because Jesse doesn't constantly need reassurance, Connor finally said. Maybe it's exhausting being with someone who's always looking for problems, always testing me, always waiting for me to fuck up so you can prove that everyone leaves eventually. That hurt because it was partially true. I had been testing him. I had been looking for problems, but only because I'd sensed something was wrong and I'd been proven right. So this is my fault? I asked. I made you emotionally cheat because I had the audacity to notice you were pulling away. I'm not cheating, we're just friends. You're spiraling into this jealous thing that's not based on reality. Then stop talking to Jesse. If it's just a friendship that doesn't mean anything, it should be easy to stop. Connor looked at me like I'd asked him to cut off a limb. That's insane. You don't get to dictate who I'm friends with. That's controlling, borderline abusive behavior. The word abusive hit me like ice water. Was I being abusive? Was I the problem in this relationship? I'd violated his privacy, issued an ultimatum, tried to isolate him from someone he cared about. All the things I'd read about in articles describing toxic partners. I backed down. I apologized for going through his phone and said I'd work on my trust issues. Connor seemed relieved, and we had awkward makeup sex that felt more like we were trying to convince ourselves we were okay than actually connecting. But nothing really changed. Connor continued talking to Jesse, just more discreetly. I continued feeling like I was losing my grip on the relationship. And the resentment between us built like pressure in a sealed container, waiting for the right moment to explode. We started having the same circular argument every few weeks. I'd express feeling disconnected from him. He'd say I was being too demanding. I'd point out specific examples of him prioritizing work or his phone or literally anything over quality time with me. He'd accuse me of being clingy and dramatic. Round and round, never resolving anything, just building up more hurt and frustration. Maybe we should take a break, he said after one particularly brutal fight in June. Just some space to figure out what we want. A break is just breaking up for cowards, I shot back. Either you want to be with me or you don't. That's exactly the kind of black and white thinking that makes this so hard, Connor said. You can't see nuance. Everything has to be a crisis. I hated that he was reframing my legitimate concerns as personal failings. I hated that he'd made me feel crazy for noticing his emotional affair. I hated that I'd become this version of myself, suspicious, anxious, constantly on edge, and I couldn't figure out how to get back to who I was before. But I also wasn't ready to leave, because leaving meant admitting failure. It meant proving my mother's cynical worldview right, that men eventually lose interest and women who demand more just end up alone. It meant starting over at almost 30, going back to dating apps and awkward first dates and explaining to yet another person why my last relationship didn't work out. So I stayed. And things got worse. We limped through the summer barely speaking to each other. We'd maintain appearances around friends, holding hands, laughing at each other's jokes, performing the couple we used to be. But at home, we were like roommates who didn't particularly like each other. He'd stay late at work, and I'd pretend I didn't know he was actually getting drinks with Jesse. I'd make plans with my own friends and post happy photos on Instagram, creating this fictional narrative of my perfect life while internally falling apart. The worst part was that I'd started to hate myself, not just for staying in a dying relationship, but for all the ways I'd compromised my own values trying to hold on to it. I'd become someone who went through their partner's phone, someone who issued ultimatums and picked fights and cried to manipulate someone into paying attention to me. Someone who measured her worth by whether a man who'd emotionally checked out months ago still wanted to fuck her occasionally. You need to either fix this or end it, Rachel said after listening to me complain for the 100th time. But you can't keep doing this to yourself. She was right, but I didn't know how to do either of those things. Fixing it would require Connor to actually want to fix it, and ending it would require me to accept defeat. So I existed in this horrible limbo, waiting for something to force a decision I couldn't make myself. That something came in late August. Connor's company had a big event, Some product launch party with an open bar and all the employees plus their partners. I've been looking forward to it for weeks, seeing it as an opportunity to reconnect, to remind ourselves why we'd got together in the first place. The day of the event, Connor came home and casually mentioned that actually, it was just employees only. Partners weren't invited anymore due to venue capacity issues. I knew he was lying. I'd seen the invitation in his email weeks ago when I was using his laptop. It clearly said +1s were welcome. You don't want me there, I said. It wasn't a question. It's not that, it's just going to be boring work stuff. You'd hate it. Jesse will be there. Connor's jaw tightened. This again? Yes, Jesse will be there because Jesse works with me because we're colleagues. You're embarrassed by me. You don't want Jesse to meet me because then it becomes real. As long as I'm this abstract girlfriend, you can keep up your little emotional affair without confronting what you're actually doing. You're being paranoid and honestly kind of pathetic, Connor said, and I saw the exact moment he realized he'd gone too far. But he didn't take it back. Pathetic. He thought I was pathetic. I should have ended it right then. That should have been the line, but instead I did something worse. I decided to prove I wasn't pathetic by showing up at the event anyway. I know how that sounds, but in my head it made perfect sense. I'd get dressed up, show up looking amazing, make him remember why he wanted me in the first place. I'd meet Jesse face to face and establish my territory. I'd stop being the invisible girlfriend he could compartmentalize away. So that's what I did. I wore the black dress Connor had always loved, did my makeup carefully, showed up at the venue an hour into the event. I walked in with my head high, scanning the crowd for Connor. I found him in the corner, laughing at something a tall, attractive person was saying. Jesse, it had to be Jesse. They had this ease with each other, this comfortable intimacy that made my stomach turn. Connor's hand was on Jesse's arm, casual and familiar in a way he hadn't touched me in months. When Connor saw me, his face went white, then red, then hard with anger. What are you doing here? He asked when I walked up, not bothering to hide his fury. I'm your girlfriend. I'm here to support you at your work event. I turned to Jesse with my brightest smile. Hi, I'm Sarah. You must be Jesse. I've heard so much about you. The next hour was one of the most excruciating of my life. Connor barely spoke to me, answering in clipped monosyllables when I tried to make conversation. Jesse was polite but clearly uncomfortable, picking up on the tension. Other coworkers asked Connor questions about his wife, and he'd have to correct them and introduce me as his girlfriend, the words sounding bitter in his mouth. I wanted to prove I wasn't pathetic, and instead I'd shown up uninvited to my boyfriend's work event and made everyone uncomfortable. I'd proven him right. We left early, Connor's hand tight and angry on my elbow as he steered me out. We didn't speak in the Uber. We didn't speak in the elevator up to my apartment. But as soon as the door closed behind us, he exploded. What the fuck was that? You humiliated me in front of my entire company. You showed up uninvited like some kind of stalker because you can't handle me having a single part of my life that isn't about you. I showed up because my boyfriend lied to me about partners being allowed. Because you're so busy protecting your relationship with Jesse that you'd rather exclude me from your life. There is no relationship with Jesse. We're friends. We're colleagues, but you've built this entire conspiracy in your head and now you're acting out like a child who's not getting enough attention. Don't gaslight me. I saw the messages. I know you tell Jesse things you don't tell me. I know you'd rather spend time with Jesse than me. Yeah, because Jesse doesn't constantly need reassurance. Jesse doesn't go through my phone or show up places uninvited or make everything into a fucking drama. We went back and forth like that for what felt like hours, both of us saying the cruelest things we could think of. He called me insecure, controlling, exhausting. I called him a liar, a cheater, emotionally unavailable. We dredged up every past argument, every old wound, every resentment we'd been stockpiling for months. I can't do this anymore, Connor finally said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. This relationship is killing me. You're killing me. Fine, leave then. If I'm so terrible, just fucking leave. Maybe I will. Yeah, then stop being such a coward and actually do it. Stop tiptoeing around, stop the emotional affair, stop pretending you want to be here when you clearly checked out months ago. Just leave. We stood there, both of us breathing hard, waiting for the other to back down like we always did. This was our pattern: fight viciously, then reconcile with sex or tears or promises to do better. The fight was never actually the end, just another cycle in our dysfunctional dance. But this time felt different. This time I could see something cold settling in Connor's eyes, a decision being made in real time. You're right, he said quietly. I should have left months ago. I stayed because I kept hoping you go back to being the person I fell in love with. But I don't think that person exists anymore. Or maybe she never did, and I just saw what I wanted to see. That hurt worse than anything else he'd said all night. The idea that I'd been a disappointment from the start, that even our good beginning was based on illusion. So that's it, you're just giving up? I'm not giving up, I'm accepting reality. We're not good together, we make each other worse, and I can't keep doing this hopping, it'll magically get better. He started walking toward the bedroom, presumably to get his things, the drawer of clothes, the toothbrush. The markers of a life we'd built together that apparently meant nothing. Something in me snapped. All the fear and anger and desperation of the last few months converged into this single moment where I needed to make him hurt the way he was hurting me. I needed to wound him to get under his skin, to say the thing that would finally make him feel as small and powerless as I'd felt this entire time. You know what? I called after him. Hannah was right. You're not ambitious enough. You're not man enough. You'd rather coast through life in your mediocre job, having your safe little emotional affair with Jesse because actually committing to something real is too fucking scary. You're pathetic. The words came out before I'd fully thought them through. I was throwing his insecurities back at him, the ones he'd shared with me in vulnerable moments, the ones I knew would hurt most. Not man enough specifically, because he told me once about his father constantly criticizing his choices, his career, his lack of traditional masculine aggression. Connor stopped walking, turned around slowly, and I saw something in his face I'd never seen before, not anger but complete emptiness. Like I'd confirmed every terrible thing he'd ever thought about himself, and watching him process that made me immediately want to take it back. Wow, he said, his voice eerily calm. Okay. Good to know what you really think. Connor, I didn't mean. No, you did. You've been thinking it this whole time. You just finally said it out loud. That's fine. Thanks for the honesty. He went to the bedroom and started packing, moving with mechanical efficiency. I followed him, trying to apologize, trying to take it back, but he wouldn't look at me. He packed his drawer of clothes into a duffel bag. Collected his toothbrush from the bathroom, his phone charger from the nightstand, the book he'd been reading from my coffee table. Please don't go like this, I said, crying now. I was angry. I said something horrible, but we can talk about this. We can work on this. There's nothing to work on, Connor said, still not looking at me. You just told me exactly what you think of me, and I'm choosing to believe you. That's the healthiest decision either of us has made in months. He walked to the door with his bag, stood there for a moment like he might say something else. Then he just left. I waited for him to come back, to text, to call, to give me a chance to really apologize, to explain that I'd lashed out from a place of hurt, that I didn't mean the terrible thing I'd said. Instead, I woke up the next morning to find myself blocked on everything. Instagram, Facebook, his phone number. Our mutual friends reported that he'd blocked them too when they tried to reach out on my behalf. He just erased me completely, like I'd never existed. The part I haven't told anyone, the part that makes me look worst, is that I'd been planning to say something like that for weeks. Not those exact words, but something designed to hurt him enough to force a reaction. I'd been cataloging his insecurities, mentally preparing weapons I could use if I needed to. Because somewhere in the toxic spiral of our last few months together, I decided that hurting him was preferable to losing him without a fight. That making him feel as bad as I felt was a form of connection, proof that we still mattered to each other. That blowing everything up was better than watching it slowly fade away. I thought if I could just provoke a big enough reaction, it would break through his emotional distance, and we'd finally have the real, raw conversation we needed to have. I thought destroying everything was how you got to the truth. I was wrong. All I did was confirm his worst fears about himself and give him a perfect reason to cut me out of his life completely. The weeks after were brutal. I cycled through every stage of grief and then some. Denial, maybe he'd reach out once he calmed down. Anger, fuck him for running away instead of fighting for us. Bargaining, if I could just explain, if he'd just listen, we could fix this. Depression, I'd ruined the best relationship I'd ever had and proven I was exactly as toxic as my worst fears about myself. I checked his Instagram obsessively through a fake account I created. He'd posted a few times, hiking photos, brunch with friends, a new apartment. He looked happy, or at least okay, like he was moving on without any trouble at all. Meanwhile, I was falling apart. I couldn't eat. I couldn't sleep. I'd replay our last fight on an endless loop, trying to identify the exact moment I could have made a different choice. I'd rehearse apologies I'd never get to deliver. Rachel finally sat me down a month after the breakup and said something I needed to hear. You're mourning the relationship you wanted to have, not the relationship you actually had. You and Connor were terrible together at the end. You brought out the worst in each other. Him leaving was the healthiest thing that could have happened. She was right, but it didn't make it hurt less. Because I wasn't just mourning Connor, I was mourning the version of myself I'd been with him. The confident, interesting woman from the wedding who made him laugh. Somewhere along the way, I'd become this paranoid, manipulative person who weaponized her partner's insecurities, and I didn't know how to reconcile those two versions of myself. I started therapy, which I should have done years ago. My therapist helped me understand that the pattern I'd seen in my relationship with Connor went back much further, to watching my mother slowly disappear in her marriage, to my own deep fear of becoming invisible or disposable, to a tendency to create the rejection I was afraid of as a way of controlling when it happened. You tested Connor constantly, my therapist said, because if he failed the test, you could leave feeling justified. But when he kept passing, you escalated. You needed him to prove he'd leave you eventually, because that confirmed your worldview. When he started pulling away naturally, it almost felt like a relief, Now you had a villain, a clear narrative, permission to blow everything up. That was hard to hear. The idea that I'd sabotaged my own relationship not in spite of wanting it to work, but because some part of me needed it to fail. I also had to confront the fact that Connor hadn't been perfect either. His emotional affair with Jesse, his defensiveness when confronted, his tendency to make me feel crazy for noticing real problems, those were his contributions to our toxic dynamic. We'd both hurt each other. We'd both made choices that corroded trust. But I'm the one who said the unforgivable thing. I'm the one who went nuclear when I could have just walked away. 3 months later, I'm still processing everything. I haven't tried to contact Connor again. He made his boundaries extremely clear, and violating them would just prove I haven't learned anything. I've deleted the fake Instagram account I was using to check on him, though that took me embarrassingly long. I've been on a couple of dates, but my heart isn't in it. I find myself comparing everyone to Connor, which is insane because Connor and I were a disaster. But I miss the beginning, the version of us that existed before I let my fears turn me into someone I don't recognize. My sister asked me the other day if I regret saying it, the not man enough comment that ended everything. And the truth is, I don't know. I regret hurting him. I regret weaponizing his trauma. I regret not being strong enough to just leave when the relationship stopped working. But part of me thinks that moment was inevitable. We were headed toward an ugly ending one way or another. Maybe by forcing it, I actually did us both a favor. Maybe staying together would have just meant more months of mutual resentment and gradual destruction. Or maybe that's just what I tell myself to sleep at night. The hardest thing to accept is that I might never know what would have happened if I'd made different choices. If I'd confronted him calmly about Jesse instead of snooping. If I'd left when I first sensed him pulling away instead of fighting to hold on. If I'd gone to therapy earlier and learned healthier ways to handle my fear of abandonment. I replay that last fight constantly, imagining different versions. In some, I don't show up at his work event. In others, I do, but I handle his anger with grace instead of escalation. In others still, I let him pack his bags without saying anything, preserving some dignity in the ending. But in none of my imagined alternatives does he stay. Because the truth I'm finally starting to accept is that Connor had already left emotionally long before that night. The relationship was over. I just refused to accept it until I forced a dramatic ending I couldn't deny. That's what I've been thinking about lately. How much of love is just two people agreeing to pretend together, and what happens when one person stops pretending but won't admit it. Connor was done with us months before I said the thing that broke us. But instead of being honest about it, he coasted, letting me be the bad guy, waiting for me to do something unforgivable so he'd have an easy out. And I gave him that. I performed exactly the role he needed me to play. I've learned a lot about myself through this process, none of it particularly flattering. I've learned that I'd rather be the villain in an explosive story than a forgettable character in a quiet ending. I've learned that my fear of abandonment is so strong I'll create the abandonment myself, violently, just to control the narrative. I've learned that I have a capacity for cruelty I didn't know existed, especially when I feel cornered. But I've also learned that I'm capable of reflection and growth, that I can acknowledge my worst behaviors without completely defining myself by them. That fucking up a relationship doesn't mean I'm fundamentally unlovable. It means I have work to do on myself before I'm ready to try again. My therapist asked me last week what I'd say to Connor if I could, and I realized I don't want to say anything to Connor. The apology I need to make isn't to him, it's to myself. For staying too long in something that was hurting me. For compromising my values trying to hold on to someone who didn't want to be held. For believing that I needed his validation to prove my worth. I said you're not man enough because I wanted to hurt him, but also because some part of me believed it. I'd built up this resentment that he wasn't the partner I needed, wasn't ambitious enough or present enough or invested enough. I was angry that he didn't fight for us the way I thought I was fighting for us. But fighting for something broken isn't noble, it's just fear wearing a disguise. The truth nobody tells you about toxic relationships is that they're not always with terrible people. Connor wasn't a villain, I'm not a villain. We were just two hurt people who brought out the worst in each other, who couldn't figure out how to be honest about our needs, who stayed together out of fear and inertia long past the relationship's expiration date. And maybe the most grown-up thing either of us did was ending it. Even if the ending was ugly. Even if we both have scars. I still think about him sometimes, wonder if he thinks about me. If he's told Jesse the whole story or just his version. If he's dating someone new, someone who doesn't trigger all his defenses, someone he can be open with in ways he couldn't with me. I hope so. I genuinely hope he's happy. But more than that, I hope I can build a version of myself that doesn't need to destroy things to feel in control. That can recognize when something isn't working and leave before it gets toxic. That can handle vulnerability without turning it into a weapon. I'm not there yet. 3 months isn't enough time to undo patterns I've spent my whole adult life building. But I'm trying. I'm in therapy twice a week. I'm reading books about attachment styles and trauma responses. I'm learning to sit with uncomfortable feelings instead of immediately trying to fix or fight or flee. And I'm learning to be honest with myself about what happened. Not the story I tell at parties about my toxic ex or the version I perform for Instagram where I'm thriving in my singleness. The real story, the one where I'm culpable and flawed and sometimes the villain in my own narrative. I said you're not man enough because I wanted Connor to hurt as much as I was hurting, because I was scared and angry and desperate, because I'd run out of healthier ways to communicate and reverted to the cruelest weapon I had. It worked. I hurt him, and he left. And I got exactly what some self-destructive part of me was asking for: proof that people leave, confirmation that I'm too much or not enough, permission to confirm every negative belief I've ever had about love. But sitting here now, 3 months later and still processing, I'm starting to think maybe that's not the whole story. Maybe the real story is about two people who tried and failed, who brought their baggage and their fears and their unhealed wounds to a relationship and hoped the other person could fix them. We couldn't fix each other. We could barely not destroy each other, and that's okay. Not every relationship is meant to last. Not every ending needs to be friendly or mutual or clean. Sometimes you say the worst thing you can think of, and the person you love packs their bags and blocks you on everything, and you have to live with that. You have to sit in the mess you created and figure out how you became someone who could say something so deliberately hurtful. I'm still figuring that out. Still sitting in the mess. Still trying to understand how the confident woman at the wedding became the desperate person hurling insults in her apartment. But at least I'm looking. At least I'm asking the questions. At least I'm not pretending it was all his fault or that I was just a victim of his emotional unavailability. I was a participant. An active creator of the dysfunction. And acknowledging that is somehow both the hardest and most freeing thing I've ever done. So no, I don't know if I regret saying it. I regret who I became in that relationship. I regret not leaving sooner. I regret the hurt I caused and the trust I violated and the weapons I deployed. But maybe I needed to hit that bottom to finally start climbing back up. Maybe I needed to see myself at my worst to decide I wanted to be better. Or maybe I'm just making meaning out of senseless destruction, because that's what we do when relationships end badly. We tell ourselves stories about growth and lessons learned when really it was just two people who couldn't make it work, for 1,000 small reasons that accumulated into one big ending. Either way, Connor's gone. I'm still here. And I have to figure out how to be someone I can stand to be, whether he ever forgives me or not. That's the real work. Not getting him back or getting closure or getting him to understand my side, but getting honest with myself about the patterns I need to break and the wounds I need to heal before I can show up healthy in any relationship. I'm not there yet, but I'm trying, and maybe that's enough for now.